For decades, families waited in silence, detectives carried unsolved files, and evidence gathered dust. In 2025, science and persistence broke open some of the darkest mysteries in history, revealing killers, naming the nameless, and closing cases once thought impossible. The question remains, what does it take to finally uncover the truth? Diane Peterson. San Jose, California, in the late 1970s was a city caught between two identities. On one hand, it was still a suburban community with tree-lined streets, high school football games, and neighborhoods where families knew each other. On the other, it was rapidly becoming the beating heart of Silicon Valley, a place where technology was changing the landscape at an unprecedented pace. But amid this optimism, a brutal act of violence would shake the city to its core. An act committed not in the shadows of some dark alleyway, but in one of the most sacred spaces in American life, a classroom. On a spring day in 1978, students at Branham High School filed into their classes as they always did. They carried textbooks under their arms, chatted with friends in the halls, and settled into seats that creaked as they leaned back. It was a scene of ordinary youth, the kind of moment parents assume will always be safe. What none of them could imagine was that, before the day ended, their beloved teacher, Diane Peterson, would be found brutally stabbed inside her classroom. The school where they recited the Pledge of Allegiance and took algebra exams was transformed into a crime scene, sealed off by yellow tape. The crime stunned the community. Parents pulled their children from class, demanding answers. Teachers locked their doors. The media descended, eager to capture the horror of a city that had just been forced to confront the unthinkable. That even in the heart of an American high school, violence could find its way in. And as shocking as the crime was, the aftermath proved even more haunting. A suspect emerged almost immediately. A confession was obtained. But justice never came. Instead, the case would sit in limbo for nearly 50 years. It would outlive both the victim and the suspect. And only in 2025 would officials finally close the book on what had become one of Santa Clara County's most disturbing and enduring cold cases. This is the story of Diane Peterson, a teacher whose life was stolen in the very place she was meant to inspire others. To understand the magnitude of this case, you first need to know who Diane Peterson was, not just as a victim, but as a person. Born in the early 1950s, Diane came of age during a period of great social change. By the time she reached adulthood, America had already lived through the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War protests, and the women's liberation movement. For Diane, becoming a teacher wasn't just a job, it was a calling. She pursued her education with determination, graduating with a degree in education and immediately setting her sights on giving back to her community. Her family later described her as someone who believed in the power of young people to change the world. Teaching wasn't a stepping stone for Diane, it was her life's work. When she began at Branham High School in San Jose, she quickly stood out among faculty. Students described her as approachable, someone who made time for kids who felt invisible in other classrooms. One student remembered her staying after school to help him study for a geometry test he thought he'd surely fail. "She didn't just teach math," he said years later. "She taught me that I was capable of more than I believed." Diane's colleagues saw her as the embodiment of energy and optimism. She was young, vibrant, and dedicated. At just 26 years old, she had already made herself indispensable to her department. For many of the teens who passed through her classroom, she was the first adult who truly listened. Friends outside of school recalled her laugh, loud, contagious, and impossible to ignore. She loved gardening, often bringing fresh flowers to brighten her classroom. She had a younger brother and a close circle of friends with whom she spent weekends hiking in the Santa Cruz Mountains. She was also, according to those who knew her best, deeply principled. She believed in fairness, in giving people second chances, and in guiding troubled youth back toward better paths. It was this compassion that made her a beloved teacher, and perhaps tragically, the very trait that left her vulnerable. The classroom where she worked every day was a space filled with posters of inspirational quotes, student artwork taped to the walls, and desks scuffed from years of restless teenagers. For Diane, it was more than a workplace. It was where she believed she could shape futures. Her family would later say that her death wasn't just a loss to them. It was a loss to every student she hadn't yet had the chance to teach, every life she hadn't yet touched. That's what made the brutality of what happened in 1978 so incomprehensible. How could someone take the life of a woman so devoted to lifting others? And perhaps the harder question, how could the system, even with a confession in hand, fail to deliver justice for nearly 5 decades? On the morning of Diane Peterson's murder, Branham High School followed its usual rhythm. Bells rang, hallways echoed with footsteps, and classrooms filled with the hum of lectures. For most, it was just another spring day in 1978. Diane's colleagues expected her to appear for an afternoon class. When she didn't, concern quickly grew. A fellow teacher went to her room and found the door unlocked. Inside, the sight was devastating. Diane Peterson lay on the floor, bleeding heavily from multiple stab wounds. Desks were pushed out of place, papers scattered, clear signs of a violent struggle. The scene was secured within minutes. Deputies from the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office responded, followed by investigators trained in homicide procedures. Students were evacuated, administrators tried to keep order, and Branham High was suddenly transformed from a school into a crime scene. Detectives noted the following evidence: weapon, a knife left near the body, blood evidence, pooled on the floor and smeared on surfaces, which could only be blood-typed at the time, fingerprints, lifted from desks, doorknobs, and the weapon itself. Room condition, an overturned desk, signs of a rapid confrontation. Parents who rushed to the school were met with officers blocking the entrances. Reporters gathered outside, pressing for details. Local headlines the next morning would emphasize the shock. A young teacher murdered in broad daylight in her own classroom. For investigators, the urgency was immediate. A homicide inside a school was nearly unheard of in Santa Clara County, and pressure mounted to find the killer quickly. Within hours, they began interviewing staff and students who might have crossed paths with Diane that day. Witness statements pointed detectives toward a troubled teenager who had been on campus. His name was Harry Nicky Nickerson. Got it. Let's continue directly into Phase 1 investigation. This section will stay tight, factual. Detectives began building a timeline. When she was last seen alive, who had access to her classroom, and which individuals were unaccounted for during the critical window. Interviews with staff and students revealed one name repeatedly: Harry Nicky Nickerson, a 16-year-old who had been seen wandering near Diane's classroom. Several witnesses noted his behavior that day as unusual, restless, evasive, and lingering in areas where he had no class. Detectives brought Nickerson in for questioning. In 1978, juvenile interrogation rules were less protective than they would later become. Present during questioning were 2 homicide investigators and, for part of the session, a juvenile officer. Records indicate that Nickerson's statements shifted under pressure. At first, he denied being near Diane's classroom. Confronted with contradictions, he eventually gave a confession, admitting he had stabbed Diane Peterson. That confession became the centerpiece of the case file. Investigators documented it carefully, noting that Nickerson provided details about the crime scene that had not been released publicly. These included the location of the weapon and the order of the attack, details that, they argued, only the perpetrator could know. But even with a confession, prosecutors faced a dilemma. In California in 1978, juveniles were treated under a different legal framework. Under Welfare and Institutions Code Section 602, the ability to prosecute a 16-year-old as an adult for homicide required careful judicial review. Prosecutors feared the confession might not survive a suppression hearing, given Nickerson's age and the absence of an attorney or parent during the critical parts of questioning. Compounding the challenge was the lack of forensic evidence linking Nickerson to the scene. Fingerprints lifted from the classroom were smudged and inconclusive. Blood could only be typed, not matched to an individual. There was no eyewitness who had seen the stabbing occur. The district attorney's office, weighing these limitations, hesitated. They had a young suspect, a confession, and circumstantial witness statements, but not the airtight case needed for a murder conviction. If they filed charges and the confession was thrown out, Nickerson could walk free, never to be tried again under double jeopardy protections. So instead, the case stalled. Investigators continued to monitor Nickerson quietly, but no indictment was filed. Officially, the homicide of Diane Peterson remained open but inactive. For Diane Peterson's family, the years following 1978 were marked by silence and disappointment. They knew a confession existed. They knew investigators believed they had the right suspect. Yet no trial came. Each year that passed deepened the sense of injustice. Why didn't prosecutors push harder? The legal climate of the late 1970s and early 1980s played a decisive role. Juvenile homicide cases were rare, and California's juvenile system emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. Prosecutors feared the defense would argue that Nickerson's confession was coerced. Without physical evidence to back it up, the case could collapse. Meanwhile, advances in forensic science were just out of reach. In the 1980s, DNA profiling was still new, expensive, and rarely applied outside of high-profile cases. The evidence from Diane's classroom remained locked in storage, its potential unrealized. Nickerson himself faded from public view. By the early 1990s, he was a troubled adult with a history of instability. In 1993, at the age of 31, he deliberately ended life. His death effectively ended any possibility of future prosecution. For Diane's family, it was another cruel twist. The man they believed responsible had taken his own life before facing justice. For investigators, the case remained open in name only. Officially, it was a cold file, reviewed occasionally but never advanced. For nearly 30 years, Diane Peterson's murder remained in limbo, a confession on paper, a dead suspect, and a grieving family with no closure. In 2025, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit revisited Peterson's file as part of a wider review of unsolved homicides. Led by a team tasked with re-examining evidence using modern standards, they scrutinized Nickerson's confession and compared it to the original case notes. What they found was compelling. Nickerson's statements contained crime scene details never made public. The position of Diane's body, the location of the weapon, and the sequence of events during the attack. Witness testimony from 1978 also placed him near the classroom at the critical time. Together, the evidence created a consistent narrative, one that had been overshadowed for decades by concerns over juvenile law. With Nickerson long deceased, prosecutors could not file charges, but they could make a formal determination. In a press conference in early 2025, the Santa Clara County DA announced that the case of Diane Peterson was officially closed. The conclusion was clear. Harry "Nicky" Nickerson had been responsible for the murder of his 26-year-old teacher in 1978. The closure brought long-awaited answers, but also left haunting questions. Chief among them, why? The case file offered no clear motive. Nickerson's confession did not explain his reasoning, and no evidence suggested a personal relationship between him and Diane. Some speculated it may have been an impulsive act, fueled by anger or instability. Others believed there could have been a hidden conflict known only to them. But officially, the motive remains unknown. The DA's statement was direct. We may never know why Harry Nickerson chose to attack Diane Peterson that day. What we do know is that his actions ended her life and devastated her family, her students, and her community. For nearly 5 decades, Diane's family carried the weight of not knowing whether the system would ever recognize her killer. In 2025, they finally received that recognition. In a public statement, relatives expressed gratitude that Diane's case had not been forgotten. Ronald Lee Novak, 1983, Walker, Iowa. December 23, 1983. In the rural farmlands of Iowa, winter pressed down hard. Roads glistened with ice, barns rattled under the weight of cold winds, and families prepared for Christmas behind windows glowing with soft light. It was a season for gathering, for tradition, for safety. But for one family in the small community of Walker, that night would mark the beginning of a nightmare, that stretched across 4 decades. Their son, 24-year-old Ronald Lee Novak, a dependable young man with a quiet strength, was found dead in a roadside ditch. His hands were bound, his body showed signs of a savage beating, and he had been shot before being left to freeze in the snow. The crime scene was so brutal that even seasoned investigators were shaken, and despite an early suspect and more than 40 leads, the case collapsed into silence. For over 40 years, Novak's murder would remain unsolved, until 2025, when forensic genealogy finally identified the man responsible. To understand why this case mattered so deeply, you have to know Ronald. Born in 1959, Novak grew up surrounded by cornfields and livestock, the son of hard-working parents who believed in discipline, community, and faith. Friends described him as even-tempered, the kind of man who rarely raised his voice, but who was always willing to lend a hand. He worked as a farmhand, moving between local properties during harvest season. Neighbors recalled seeing him driving tractors, hauling grain, and helping older farmers without being asked. Ronnie was one of those people who didn't just say he'd help, he showed up. One local later told reporters. Hunting and fishing were his passions. On weekends, Novak would disappear into the woods with a rifle slung over his shoulder or spend hours along the riverbank. He was a marksman, not boastful, but skilled. His friends remembered him as someone who felt most at home outdoors, in the silence of Iowa's backcountry. He wasn't wealthy, but he was steady. His parents often said they expected him to start his own farm one day. He lived simply, trusted easily, and was known to be dependable. To those who loved him, he was the kind of young man who made small-town life stronger. That's what made the violence of his death so incomprehensible. The night of December 23, 1983. Ronald had plans that evening. Friends said he was supposed to stop by for a gathering before Christmas Eve. He wasn't the kind to skip out without notice. So when he failed to arrive, people worried almost immediately. By early morning, those fears became reality. A local farmer driving his truck along a desolate county road spotted something unusual in the ditch. At first, it looked like debris partially covered by snow. But as he drew closer, the shape became clear. It was a body. Deputies from the Delaware County Sheriff's Office arrived quickly. When they rolled the young man over, they saw the face of Ronald Novak. The condition of his body left no doubt. This was a homicide. His hands were bound with rope, tied tightly around his wrists. His face and torso bore signs of a beating, with deep bruises and lacerations. He had been shot, a fatal wound that ended his life before he was abandoned in the ditch. The winter storm had frozen his remains, preserving the brutality and chilling detail. The farmer who found him later told reporters he had never seen violence like it. For a community where most crimes amounted to property disputes or minor thefts, the killing was unimaginable. The homicide of Ronald Novak was unlike anything Delaware County had seen in years. Sheriff's deputies secured the crime scene, but they quickly realized they needed more resources. Within 24 hours, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, DCI, dispatched agents to Walker to support the county's small department. Deputies and DCI agents began their work the old-fashioned way, door-to-door canvassing. Farmers within a 5-mile radius were interviewed. Bar patrons and friends were questioned. Over the first 10 days, detectives logged more than 40 separate tips, ranging from alleged sightings of Novak the night he died to whispers about grudges he might have carried. The leads seemed promising at first, but they quickly fizzled. Investigators inventoried every piece of physical evidence. Rope bindings from Novak's wrists were bagged, photographed, and stored. They bore knots that detectives believed might have been distinctive, potentially tied by someone familiar with farming or hauling equipment. Shell casings found near the body were collected for ballistic testing. But without the firearm itself, investigators could only record the caliber, not match it definitively. Clothing and boots were preserved in paper bags, showing traces of blood and soil. Analysts attempted to identify footprints near the ditch, but the snowfall had erased most impressions. Hair and fiber samples were lifted from Novak's jacket. Under a microscope, some appeared consistent with human hair, but without DNA profiling, the samples were effectively unusable. In 1983, Blood typing was the limit of what labs could do with biological material. If a suspect's blood type didn't match, they could be excluded, but they could not be tied to the scene with certainty. The lack of modern DNA tools would become one of the biggest barriers in this case. Detectives built out a profile of Novak's life, looking for enemies. His reputation for reliability and kindness made this difficult. No one described him as quarrelsome. He wasn't in debt, wasn't known for risky behavior, and had no criminal record. But one name emerged during interviews: Michael Shapert. Shapert, who lived in the area at the time, was said to have known Novak casually. His name appeared in the early case files because of proximity. He had been seen around the time of the murder and was known to investigators. Detectives questioned him, but his answers were vague rather than incriminating. Without forensic evidence linking him to the crime, there was little reason to hold him. His name went into the file, and life moved on. At the time, detectives didn't know how important that interview would become. The murder rattled Walker. This was a town where most people left their doors unlocked and neighbors waved from porches. Suddenly, that sense of security was gone. Local newspapers covered the crime with urgency. Headlines described the bound and beaten victim, emphasizing the unusual cruelty. Parents began warning teenagers not to travel rural roads at night. Church sermons referenced Novak by name, praying for justice. The whispers didn't stop. Some speculated the killing was tied to drugs, though investigators found no evidence Ronald had been involved. Others thought it was a robbery gone wrong, but nothing was taken from his body. The truth was simpler and more frustrating. The investigators had little to go on. By March 1984, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. The sheriff's office couldn't justify dedicating full-time manpower to a case with no new evidence. The DCI rotated other priorities, leaving Novak's file in the open pending leads category. 3 key factors had doomed the investigation in its first year: forensic limitations. Without DNA, the evidence, rope, hair, fibers, sat useless. Ballistics could only identify a caliber, not a specific gun. Lost opportunities. Snowfall destroyed footprints and vehicle tracks. Witnesses were scattered by the holidays, and memories faded quickly. Legal barriers. With no eyewitness, no weapon, and no confession, prosecutors had nothing to present in court. Even naming a suspect publicly would have been risky. By the mid-1980s, Novak's case was cold. The family received fewer updates. Detectives moved on, and the name of Michael Shapert, once briefly in the spotlight, faded into the margins of an unsolved murder file. For Ronald's family, the holidays never felt the same again. Each December 23rd marked another year without answers. His parents grew older, passing away without ever knowing who killed their son. Surviving siblings held on, determined not to let his memory fade, but with each year of silence, their hope thinned. The case remained technically open, but inactive. The Delaware County Sheriff's Office occasionally reviewed it, and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, DCI, kept Novak's file in their cold case archives. Detectives would sometimes revisit witnesses, but with no forensic advancements to work with, every lead ended the same way: in frustration. The media didn't forget entirely. Local newspapers in Cedar Rapids and Des Moines occasionally ran unsolved Iowa crimes retrospectives, where Novak's name would appear alongside other victims. But the stories were brief, reminders rather than breakthroughs. In Walker itself, the murder left scars. People locked their doors, something that had never been common before. Parents repeated warnings about traveling rural roads at night. Some speculated wildly about drug ties or organized crime. Others whispered that the killer must have been one of their own, someone they knew. What no one realized was that the truth had already brushed past them. Detectives had spoken to the killer in 1983. His name, Michael Shapert, was in the file all along, buried among dozens of interviews. Without science to prove his guilt, he had slipped back into everyday life, living quietly while the Novak family endured decades of uncertainty. By 2025, cold case investigations looked nothing like they had in the 1980s. The rise of forensic genetic genealogy, FGG, had revolutionized the field. With cooperation from companies like Othram, investigators could now take DNA evidence from old cases, build genealogical trees, and trace suspects through family connections. The Novak file was flagged by the DCI Cold Case Unit as a candidate for re-examination. The rope bindings and clothing preserved since 1983 were sent to Othram's lab in Texas, where cutting-edge DNA extraction methods were applied. Analysts managed to pull a viable DNA profile. That profile didn't match anyone in CODIS, the National Criminal Database, but when uploaded into genealogical databases, it produced distant family connections. From there, genealogists began constructing family trees, narrowing the possibilities until one name stood out: Michael Shapert. Investigators moved carefully. They sought a court order for a trash pull at Shapert's residence. Items discarded at his home were collected and tested. The DNA matched the profile from Novak's bindings with overwhelming probability. The science was decisive. 42 years after Ronald Novak was killed, investigators had their man. In May 2025, 64-year-old Michael Shapert was arrested and charged with first-degree murder under Iowa Code Section 707.2. Shapert's arrest made headlines statewide. A man who had once been questioned and cleared in 1983 was now identified as the killer. The motive, however, remains unclear. Prosecutors have not released specifics, citing ongoing proceedings. Some court filings hint at a possible personal dispute between Novak and Shapert, but details are still sealed. What is certain is that the violence, the binding, the beating, the shooting, suggests anger, control, or a need to silence Novak. As of mid-2025, Shapert awaits trial. Prosecutors have signaled they will seek the maximum penalty allowed by law. For Novak's surviving siblings, the arrest was bittersweet. At the DCI press conference announcing the charges, one family member said, "40 years of waiting is finally over. Our parents didn't live to see this day, but we know they're at peace knowing Ron's killer has been found." Louisa Jane Dunn, 1967, Bristol, England. June 1967. In Bristol, a city known for its historic harbors and narrow streets, a crime unfolded that would remain unresolved for nearly 6 decades. Louisa Jane Dunn, a 75-year-old widow living alone, was discovered raped and murdered inside her modest home. For investigators in 1967, it was a horrifying case. An elderly woman attacked in her own house, a place that should have been her sanctuary. Despite collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses, the case went cold. Generations of detectives revisited it, but without the power of modern DNA testing, the file gathered dust. Until 2025, when forensic advancements combined with preserved evidence and meticulous genealogical work identified the perpetrator. That man, now in his 90s, was convicted in court, finally bringing closure to a crime that had haunted Bristol since the Summer of Love. To understand why this case resonated for so long, it's important to know who Louisa was. Born in the late 1800s, she had lived through 2 world wars, seen the Great Depression, and watched Britain transform in the post-war years. By 1967, Louisa was 75, retired, and widowed. She lived alone in a small terraced house in Bristol, known among neighbors as quiet but kind. She was a creature of routine. Each morning she walked to the local shops to pick up bread and milk. She attended church faithfully on Sundays and was known for tending flowers in her small garden. She wasn't wealthy, but she carried herself with dignity, and her resilience was respected by those who knew her. Her family described her as fiercely independent. Despite her age, she insisted on living alone, priding herself on self-sufficiency. Neighbors often looked in on her, but she rarely asked for help. That independence, tragically, also left her vulnerable. On a June morning in 1967, Louisa failed to appear for her routine walk to the local bakery. Concerned, a neighbor went to check on her. When repeated knocks went unanswered, they contacted police. What officers found inside her home was shocking. Louisa's body was discovered in her bedroom. She had been raped and murdered. The scene showed clear signs of violence: the bed disturbed, clothing torn, and evidence of a forced assault. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting she either knew her attacker or had been surprised with the door unlocked. Forensic science at the time was rudimentary. Police collected what they could: blood and biological samples, stored though their potential was limited in 1967. A palm print found on furniture near the body, clothing and bedding, bagged and catalogued for analysis. The attack was brutal, but investigators had little to work with beyond the samples and print. There were no witnesses, no obvious suspects, and no clear motive. The case immediately drew widespread attention in Bristol. Newspapers reported the shocking details: an elderly woman, defenseless, attacked in the very place she should have been safest. The public was horrified. Community meetings were held, with residents demanding action and protection for the city's elderly. The initial investigation was led by the Bristol Constabulary, the forerunner of today's Avon and Somerset Police. Senior officers assigned multiple detectives, including members of the Homicide and Serious Crime Unit, to the scene. For them, this was not just another case. It was a crime that cut deeply at public trust. If someone could break into, or be welcomed into, the home of a 75-year-old widow and kill her, no one in Bristol was safe. Investigators combed Louisa's modest terraced home for clues. They mapped the scene meticulously: the disrupted bed, the torn clothing, the signs of a struggle. Crime scene photography in 1967 was less advanced than today, but detectives still built a careful record. The palm print recovered from furniture became the cornerstone of the early case. Every known offender in Bristol who fit the possible profile had their prints compared. None matched. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewing anyone who might have seen suspicious activity. They developed a handful of persons of interest, but none could be tied conclusively to the crime. The palm print didn't match anyone in police files. The biological evidence, though carefully stored, couldn't yet be analyzed with precision. Detectives developed a short list of possible suspects, known offenders in the area, particularly men with histories of sexual violence or burglary. Dozens were questioned. Their alibis were checked and prints compared. All were excluded. Neighbors and acquaintances. Given that there was no forced entry, investigators considered the possibility that Louisa may have known her attacker. Neighbors were interviewed extensively, but no one reported suspicious activity around her home that night. Transient workers and drifters. Bristol's position as a port city meant there was regular movement of sailors and laborers. Police circulated descriptions, but no credible link emerged. The interviews and sweeps produced nothing concrete. Each name raised, each rumor followed, ended in dead ends. The most frustrating obstacle was technology. The samples collected at the scene were carefully stored, but in 1967 there was little they could reveal. DNA testing was still more than a decade away from becoming a tool in criminal investigations. At best, analysts could test for blood type. That information was useful for exclusions, but couldn't identify an individual. The biological evidence from the assault was preserved in tubes and vials, placed in long-term storage. But for the detectives of 1967, it was little more than a reminder of the crime's brutality. The palm print, too, was limited by the era. Automated fingerprint identification systems, AFIS, didn't exist yet. Every comparison had to be done by hand, against paper files and inked cards. Unless the attacker was already in police records, the print was essentially a ghost. As weeks passed without an arrest, public pressure mounted. Newspapers ran headlines demanding progress. Editorials asked how such a heinous act could happen in Bristol without swift justice. Community leaders reassured citizens that the investigation was ongoing. Detectives emphasized that no stone was being left unturned. But behind the scenes, frustration was mounting. The case file grew thicker, the tips slowed, and nothing tied any individual to the crime. By late summer 1967, leads had dried up completely. Officers rotated to other pressing cases, and Louisa's murder slipped into the backlog. For her family, the silence was devastating. They buried their loved one without answers, left only with the fear and uncertainty that her killer was still out there. Looking back, investigators later identified 3 reasons why Louisa's murder slipped through their grasp in 1967. Lack of technology. The samples collected were ahead of their time, evidence waiting for science to catch up. No eyewitnesses. No one saw or heard the attack. The neighborhood was quiet, and the walls of her terraced home concealed the violence. Limited suspect pool. With no clear motive, detectives couldn't narrow their focus. The palm print became their only tangible clue, and when it failed to match, the investigation collapsed. By the early 1970s, Louise's file was categorized as unsolved. Detectives occasionally revisited it when new offenders entered the system, rechecking prints or re-interviewing potential witnesses. But year after year, the evidence refused to speak. For Louise's family, the lack of answers compounded the grief. For the community, the murder became one of those cases people whispered about, a symbol of fear, a question left hanging. Little did they know, the evidence preserved in 1967 would one day prove decisive. But that day was still decades away. Through the 1970s and 1980s, those samples sat untouched. Analysts occasionally re-examined them using improved serology tests, but without DNA technology, they remained inert. By the late 1980s, DNA profiling began to transform criminal investigations in the United States and Britain. Detectives revisited Louise's file, sending samples to be tested. But the technology was still primitive, often requiring large quantities of DNA to produce a profile. The degraded samples from 1967 didn't yield results at that time. The case returned to cold storage. Despite repeated setbacks, Louise's case was never formally closed. In the 1990s, Avon and Somerset police created a dedicated cold case team, and her murder was one of the first files placed on their roster. Detectives knew the brutality of the attack demanded persistence. They re-examined the file multiple times. In the early 1990s, when the first DNA testing became available. Again in the early 2000s, when improved amplification techniques were introduced. And once more in the 2010s, when forensic genealogy began to emerge as a possibility. Each time the evidence was tested, retested, and preserved for the next leap in technology. Each time the family was updated, but always with the same message. We're not there yet. Nearly 6 decades after Louise's death, the samples preserved from her home were tested again. This time, the results changed everything. In 2025, Avon and Somerset police partnered with forensic specialists to re-examine the biological evidence collected in 1967. Using advanced DNA profiling and probabilistic genotyping, scientists were able to extract a usable profile from degraded material. That profile was compared against the UK's National DNA Database. The result was a hit. The DNA matched Ryland Headley, a 92-year-old man living quietly in southern England. At the time of the murder, Headley had been in his early 30s. His name had never been at the forefront of the 1967 investigation, but preserved evidence now linked him directly to the attack. The palm print taken from Louise's furniture was re-examined using modern digital imaging. When compared against Headley's known prints, the match was confirmed. Detectives built a timeline. Headley had lived in the Bristol area in the late 1960s. Witness statements, rechecked against old files, placed him near Louise's street around the time of the murder. Combined with the DNA and palm print, the evidence was overwhelming. In early 2025, police arrested Headley. The elderly man was charged with rape and murder under English law. Despite his advanced age, prosecutors made clear that the severity of his crime demanded a trial. Headley's trial began in mid-2025 at Bristol Crown Court. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, DNA linking him to the crime, the palm print confirmation, and corroborating witness testimony. Headley was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years, effectively a life sentence given his age. The motive, as often happens in cases this old, remained unclear. Prosecutors argued that Headley's actions reflected opportunistic sexual violence. He targeted a vulnerable woman living alone, forced his way into her home, and silenced her. There was no evidence of robbery. It was an assault for power, control, and gratification. For Louise's descendants, the verdict was bittersweet. Many of her immediate relatives had passed away, never knowing who killed her. But surviving family members attended the proceedings, hearing for the first time the words they had waited decades to hear: guilty. One relative told reporters, "It took nearly 60 years, but our family finally has answers." We never stopped hoping this day would come. In Bristol, the conviction closed one of the city's longest-running mysteries. Residents who had grown up hearing warnings about Louisa's murder expressed relief that justice had finally been served. Avon and Somerset police called it a triumph of perseverance and forensic science. Detectives emphasized that the case should serve as a reminder: preserving evidence matters. The science of 1967 couldn't solve this case, one investigator said, but the science of 2025 could. That is why we never give up. Donna Oglev, 1998, Toronto, Canada. March 1998. Toronto, Canada's largest city, was alive with the usual rhythm of downtown traffic. Taxis honking, neon lights flickering against wet asphalt, and late-night workers hurrying to catch the last train. But that night, hidden in the shadows of a parking lot, a crime unfolded that stunned the city. Donna Oglev, just 24 years old and pregnant, was found strangled to death. A woman preparing to bring life into the world had hers brutally taken away. Her case would torment detectives, devastate her family, and haunt Toronto for decades. Leads dried up. Forensic science stalled. But among the evidence collected that night was a biological trace that would lie dormant for nearly 3 decades, waiting for technology to catch up. In 2025, that trace finally spoke, and with it came the name of the man responsible. Donna wasn't a statistic. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and just months away from becoming a mother. Born in the mid-1970s, she grew up in Toronto's East End in a close-knit family. Friends remembered her as quick to laugh, stubborn in her opinions, but always loyal. She worked part-time in retail and occasionally helped neighbors with babysitting to earn extra money. Her mother described her as a fighter, not someone who gave up easily, even when life was tough. By 1998, she was expecting her first child. She spoke often about the baby, debating names with her friends and rubbing her stomach whenever conversations turned to the future. Her family said she was nervous but excited, determined to raise her child and do things right. She wasn't wealthy. She didn't have everything figured out, but she had a plan. Work, save, and create a stable home for her baby. Her pregnancy was her motivation. It shaped every choice she made in those final months. That future was stolen in a single night. On a chilly March evening, a passerby walking near a downtown Toronto parking lot noticed something unusual: a figure lying between 2 parked cars. At first he thought it might be a person asleep, a sad but not uncommon sight in the city. But as he drew closer, he realized the truth was far darker. He called 911. When officers from the Toronto Police Service Homicide Squad arrived, they found Donna Oglev's body. She had been strangled. Her clothing showed signs of a struggle. Her handbag lay nearby, contents spilled across the pavement. Her pregnancy made the discovery even more heartbreaking for the officers at the scene. The parking lot was quickly sealed off with tape. Under harsh floodlights, evidence technicians began their work. Biological samples were carefully collected from Donna's body and clothing. Fibers and hairs were bagged for comparison. Personal belongings were photographed and preserved. The area was canvassed for witnesses and security cameras, though in 1998, coverage was patchy and grainy at best. The coroner later confirmed what detectives already suspected. Donna had been killed by manual strangulation. Her unborn child died with her. Toronto was shaken. Violent crime was not unheard of, but the murder of a young, pregnant woman in such a public location was different. Headlines in the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail emphasized not just her death, but the fact that 2 lives had been lost. Editorials condemned the brutality. Women's advocacy groups demanded answers. Candlelight vigils were held in the neighborhood where Donna lived. Her family, devastated, pleaded for justice. Her mother told reporters she was ready to be a mother herself. Whoever did this took 2 lives that night. For weeks, the story dominated local news, but as days turned into months, the case grew colder. Leads evaporated. Detectives struggled to tie evidence to any known suspect. Still, tucked away in a Toronto evidence locker were the biological samples collected that night. Samples that in 1998 revealed nothing, but in 2025 would expose the truth. From the beginning, the detectives understood the gravity of what they were dealing with. The murder of a young pregnant woman wasn't just another case. It was a crime that demanded answers both for Donna's family and for the unborn child who never had a chance at life. Forensic officers documented every detail of the scene. They recovered the biological material that, in 1998, could only be tested for basic DNA matches in a small Canadian database. Fibers and hairs from Donna's clothing, stored for later analysis. Handbag contents, which included personal ID, loose change, and scattered cosmetics. Soil samples and debris from the parking lot surface, taken in hopes of linking a suspect's shoes or vehicle. At the time, the most they could do with biological samples was generate a profile for comparison in CODIS and the RCMP's newly expanding National DNA Databank, which had only just begun taking shape in the late 1990s. No matches came back. Detectives also checked nearby businesses for security footage, but unlike today's world where cameras blanket nearly every block, 1998 Toronto had only a handful of grainy analog systems. None captured the moment of Donna's murder. Detectives canvassed downtown Toronto extensively. They interviewed witnesses who had seen Donna in the days leading up to her death, along with people who lived or worked near the parking lot. Several lines of inquiry emerged. Known offenders in the area. Police questioned men with histories of violence or sexual assault. Dozens were checked against the evidence, but without DNA matches, they couldn't be tied to the crime. Acquaintances and past partners. Investigators looked into Donna's relationships, interviewing men she had dated or known socially. Each was asked to provide an alibi and, in some cases, blood or saliva samples for exclusion. All were cleared. Random opportunistic attack. Given the location, detectives considered whether the crime had been a chance encounter. This theory became the most likely after other leads failed. Despite the exhaustive work, the suspect list shrank to nothing. The Toronto press demanded answers. Headlines described the case as the parking lot killing and emphasized the tragedy of Donna's pregnancy. Talk radio hosts fielded calls from listeners outraged at the idea that such a brutal crime could happen in the heart of the city without swift justice. Detective Sergeant Raybould held press conferences urging the public to come forward. "Somebody knows something," he said in April 1998. "We need the public's help to solve this." Tips came in, but most were dead ends, vague sightings, speculation, and false leads. By late 1998, the case was losing momentum. Despite solid investigative work, 3 barriers proved insurmountable at the time. Forensic limitations, DNA databases were still small. Unless the perpetrator had already been convicted and sampled, there would be no match. The biological evidence from Donna's body remained unidentified. Lack of surveillance. The parking lot had no working cameras. Downtown businesses provided only partial coverage, none showing the attack. Absence of witnesses. No one had seen or heard the murder. The attack happened in minutes, in an urban environment where people often looked the other way. By early 1999, Detective Raybould admitted the case had gone cold. "We have evidence, we have determination, but right now we don't have a suspect we can charge," he told reporters. Donna's family was devastated. For them, each update from police became another reminder of what they had lost. A daughter, a sister, a soon-to-be mother. After 1999, Donna's case slipped into the cold file roster of the Toronto Police Service. For her family, this was the most painful stage. Silence. Detectives stopped calling as often. The vigils faded. Headlines gave way to newer crimes. What remained was grief, a wound that never closed. Her mother later told reporters, "Every Christmas, every birthday, it's like losing her again." And not just her. The baby, too. In Toronto, people remembered Donna's case as one of the city's most haunting unsolved murders. True crime features in the mid-2000s often listed her among the city's tragedies. Women's advocacy groups kept her name alive in campaigns about violence against women. reminding the public that justice had not been served. What no one outside the homicide squad knew was that Donna's evidence had been carefully preserved. The fibers, the hairs, and most importantly, the biological samples collected in 1998 were kept in secure evidence storage, cataloged and protected against degradation. Those samples would become the key. In early 2025, Toronto police reopened Donna's file with the help of Othram Labs, a Texas-based forensic genetics company specializing in solving cold cases through forensic genetic genealogy, FGG. Scientists re-examined the DNA from the 1998 samples. Unlike in the late 1990s when databases were small and technology limited, today's methods could extract viable profiles from even degraded evidence. The DNA profile was uploaded into genealogical databases. From there, Othram's genealogists began building family trees, tracing distant relatives, narrowing branches until one name emerged, a man who had been overlooked or cleared decades earlier. Detectives secured a warrant for a surreptitious collection of his discarded items. When his DNA was compared against the profile from Donna's evidence, the match was clear. Statistically, the odds of error were infinitesimal. After 27 years, Toronto police had their suspect. In March 2025, homicide detectives announced the arrest. The man was charged with first-degree murder under the Canadian Criminal Code. Prosecutors presented the charges in a Toronto courtroom. The suspect, now in his late 50s, appeared frail compared to the monster described in police reports from 1998. The motive has not been fully disclosed. Investigators suggested it was opportunistic, an attack driven by violence and control rather than robbery. Donna's personal belongings had been left behind, making theft unlikely. At the time of writing, the case is proceeding through Canadian courts. The arrest itself, however, marked the resolution of one of Toronto's longest unsolved homicides. For Donna's relatives, the news was overwhelming. They had waited nearly 3 decades. Many had assumed they would never learn who killed her. Her mother's statement at the press conference was simple but powerful. "We never stopped thinking of her. We never stopped thinking of the baby. Now, finally, we have a name." Community groups in Toronto held a vigil in her memory in spring 2025, not only to honor Donna, but to recognize the countless families still waiting for answers. The case became a rallying point for advocates of cold case funding and forensic innovation. Detectives emphasized the importance of perseverance. "Evidence doesn't lie," one investigator said. "Sometimes it just needs time and science to speak." Leslie Prier, 2001, Chevy Chase, Maryland. July 2001. Chevy Chase, Maryland, an affluent Washington, D.C. suburb known for tree-lined streets, stately homes, and quiet security. But behind one of those front doors, police found a crime scene so violent it contradicted everything people thought they knew about their safe suburban neighborhood. Leslie Prier, a 49-year-old speech pathologist, wife, and mother, was discovered beaten to death inside her home. A woman known for compassion and patience had been subjected to an unrelenting personal attack. The brutality of the crime stunned Montgomery County. This was not a random burglary gone wrong. It was rage, unleashed within the walls of her own home. For investigators, the scene offered clues: blood, fibers, foreign DNA. But the science of 2001 was still young. The case went cold for nearly 24 years. Then, in 2025, DNA finally delivered the answer. To understand why her murder struck such a nerve, you have to know who Leslie Prier was. Born in 1952, Leslie had built a career as a speech pathologist, helping children and adults find their voices after illness or injury. Colleagues described her as meticulous, endlessly patient, and gifted at connecting with people others might overlook. At home, she was a wife and mother. Friends called her warm, dependable, and generous with her time. She volunteered locally, mentored younger clinicians, and was known in her Chevy Chase neighborhood for waving hello on her evening walks. Her life was steady, rooted, and community-oriented. There was nothing in her background that would suggest risk or danger. That's part of what made her murder so shocking. It seemed to come from nowhere. On a July morning in 2001, A colleague became concerned when Leslie failed to show up for scheduled appointments. Calls went unanswered. Hours later, a family member entered her home and discovered a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. Leslie's body was found inside her residence. She had been brutally beaten, suffering blunt force trauma consistent with multiple blows. There were signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, scattered objects, bloodstains. The neighborhood was rocked. Chevy Chase, with its reputation for safety and privilege, was suddenly the site of a murder investigation. Residents locked doors. Community meetings filled with fear and speculation. And for Leslie's family, a life built around compassion and stability had ended in unimaginable violence. The case fell to the Montgomery County Police Department's Homicide Unit, one of the busiest suburban homicide divisions in the country given its proximity to Washington, D.C. The lead investigator was Detective Corporal Mark Janney, supported by Detective Sergeant Dave Davis and forensic specialists from the county's crime scene unit. The state's attorney's office also assigned a liaison early, recognizing the gravity of the case and the high-profile nature of a murder in Chevy Chase. They worked the scene methodically. Photographs captured the chaos: toppled furniture, blood patterns, broken items. Evidence technicians vacuumed for trace material, swabbed for DNA, and logged every potential clue. Forensic specialists documented blood samples on surfaces that tested as mixed. Leslie's blood, but also an unknown male contributor. Skin cells under Leslie's fingernails, suggesting she had fought back and scratched her attacker. Fibers and hairs from clothing and bedding, some of which were preserved in sealed envelopes. Signs of forced entry, confirming the intruder had not been invited. A potential murder weapon, a heavy household object bearing traces of Leslie's blood. The evidence suggested an attack of prolonged rage, not a quick strike. Investigators believed the killer spent time in the house, leaving behind biological material. But in 2001, DNA testing had limits. Analysts could generate a partial profile of the unknown male DNA. But when it was run through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, there was no match. Without a known suspect to test against, the samples sat in storage. Investigators built a suspect pool based on three main angles of burglary theory. Given the signs of forced entry, detectives considered whether Leslie interrupted a burglar. Known offenders in the area were interviewed, but none matched the evidence. Personal conflict theory. Detectives interviewed Leslie's colleagues, friends, and family. No evidence of marital strife or grudges emerged. Everyone described her as kind, professional, and without enemies. Random opportunistic attack. With no robbery and no personal motive visible, detectives leaned toward a random assault. But without an identified suspect, it was impossible to prove. The investigation generated dozens of interviews, but each potential lead collapsed under scrutiny. Chevy Chase residents were stunned. The idea that a woman could be beaten to death in her own home in broad daylight seemed unthinkable. Neighbors organized safety meetings. Some installed new locks and alarms. Local newspapers emphasized the brutality, describing the case as one of the most disturbing domestic crime scenes in Montgomery County memory. Detectives were flooded with tips in the first 48 hours, many of them vague. Reports of suspicious men in the neighborhood, or cars parked on side streets. None produced results. By the end of 2001, momentum slowed. Several obstacles doomed the first investigation phase. Forensic limitations. DNA technology in 2001 could generate partial profiles, but not the high-resolution sequencing available today. With no CODIS match, the evidence could not identify a suspect. Lack of witnesses. No one saw the attacker enter or leave. The neighborhood, though close-knit, produced no direct testimony. No motive. Burglary, domestic dispute, personal vendetta. None of the theories fit neatly. Prosecutors could not move forward with what looked like circumstantial evidence. By 2002, the case had gone cold. Leslie's murder was filed in the Montgomery County Cold Case Archive, labeled Open, No Active Leads. For her family, it was unbearable. They buried Leslie without answers, knowing her killer had walked free. After 2002, Leslie's case faded from headlines, but not from memory. Her family lived with constant questions. Who could hate her enough to beat her so savagely? Why had police been unable to catch him? Every holiday, every anniversary of her death, reopened the wound. Montgomery County Police kept the file technically open, but resources went to newer homicides. Occasionally, cold case detectives revisited it when new technology emerged, sending swabs to labs in the mid-2000s and again in the 2010s. But the results were always the same: a DNA profile of an unknown male, unmatched in CODIS. Community memory lingered longer. Chevy Chase residents would recall the crime when discussing neighborhood safety. To them, it was a reminder that even in affluent, quiet streets, violence could erupt inside a family's home. The only constant was the evidence, carefully preserved in secure storage, waiting for science to catch up. In early 2025, Montgomery County's Cold Case Unit partnered with forensic analysts for another review. This time, technology was ready. The biological evidence collected in 2001 was retested using probabilistic genotyping and enhanced STR, short tandem repeat analysis. Scientists generated a full profile and ran it through national databases. The result was a match. The DNA pointed to Eugene Gligor, a man with prior contacts in the system. Detectives reopened the case, re-interviewed witnesses, and reconstructed his whereabouts in 2001. The evidence aligned. Gligor had ties to the area at the time of the murder, and the biological material found under Leslie's fingernails was a statistical match to him. With confirmation in hand, Montgomery County Police arrested Gligor in early 2025. He was charged with first-degree murder under Maryland law. In April 2025, Gligor appeared in Montgomery County Circuit Court. Confronted with overwhelming forensic evidence and the prospect of trial, he entered a guilty plea. The court sentenced him to 22 years in prison. Prosecutors described the crime as an unrelenting attack. Though the precise motive was never fully articulated in court, authorities emphasized that it appeared personal. Rage and violence directed squarely at Leslie inside her own home. The guilty plea marked the first time Leslie's family had heard her killer's name spoken aloud in a courtroom. For Leslie's relatives, the resolution was bittersweet. Nothing could return the wife, mother, and professional they lost in 2001. But after more than 2 decades of waiting, there was an answer. Her daughter said in a statement, "My mother gave her life to helping people find their voices." For 24 years, she had none. Today, the truth speaks for her. In Chevy Chase, the news brought closure. Neighbors who had lived in quiet fear since 2001 expressed relief that justice had finally arrived, even if late. For Montgomery County detectives, the case was a reminder that persistence and preservation matter. Evidence collected in 2001 had carried the truth for 24 years, waiting for the right tools. Maud Holden, 1994, Portland, Maine. September 1994. Portland, Maine, a coastal city known for its working waterfront, historic brick buildings, and close-knit neighborhoods. But one late night, flames tore through a modest apartment building in the heart of town. When firefighters battled their way inside, they found Maud Holden, a 73-year-old widow, dead in her unit. At first, it looked like a tragic accident, an elderly woman caught in a fire she could not escape. But investigators soon discovered something far darker. The blaze had been deliberately set. This was no accident. It was arson. For years, detectives chased leads but failed to secure charges. The case slipped into Portland's cold file archive, unsolved for nearly 3 decades. Then in 2025, new witness testimony and a re-examination of the case finally named a suspect. But justice would never reach a courtroom. To her neighbors, Maud Holden was more than just a resident of that apartment building. She was a fixture in the community. Born in the 1920s, Maud had lived through the Depression, World War II, and the many changes of 20th century America. By 1994, she was 73 years old, a widow who had chosen to remain independent in her own apartment. She lived on a fixed income, careful with her money, but always generous with her time. Neighbors described her as polite but private. She had a daily routine: short walks to the local grocer, coffee in the mornings at the corner diner, and evenings spent with her crossword puzzles and knitting. Though not wealthy, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She was the type of person people trusted to water plants when they were away, or to offer a warm greeting in the hallway. She wasn't flashy, and she wasn't known to have enemies. That's part of what made her death so disturbing. On the night of September 14, 1994, Portland firefighters were dispatched to a multi-unit apartment building after reports of heavy smoke and visible flames. Crews arrived to find the structure engulfed. Residents scrambled to evacuate as firefighters pushed through smoke-filled hallways. In one unit, they found Maud Holden. She had succumbed before she could escape. At first, responders believed she had been overcome by smoke inhalation, trapped by the spreading flames. But as fire investigators sifted through the wreckage, they noticed unusual burn patterns. Accelerant residue was detected in multiple locations. The fire had not spread naturally. It had been set intentionally. The Maine State Fire Marshal's office and Portland Police Department quickly declared the fire an act of arson homicide. Evidence was collected. Accelerant traces from the flooring and walls. Debris samples for laboratory analysis. Witness statements from residents who had seen suspicious activity that night. Still, no suspect emerged. The case was immediately high profile. An elderly woman killed in an intentional fire in the middle of a Portland neighborhood. Residents demanded justice. But in 1994, without cameras on every corner or advanced forensic tools, the investigation would soon stall. From the beginning, the case was a joint effort. The Portland Police Department Homicide Unit partnered with the Maine State Fire Marshal's office, which handled fire origin analysis and arson investigations. Detective Sergeant Tom Joyce of Portland PD took lead on the homicide side. Investigator Ed O'Brien from the Fire Marshal's office oversaw the technical work of determining where and how the fire had started. Together, they treated Maud's apartment not just as a fire scene, but as a crime scene. The science available at the time had limits. Fire debris was tested for accelerants using gas chromatography, and traces consistent with gasoline were confirmed. Investigators determined the fire had multiple points of origin, a signature indicator of arson. But beyond proving the fire was intentional, evidence was sparse. No fingerprints survived the blaze. DNA recovery was in its infancy, and samples degraded by fire and water left nothing usable. Witnesses described seeing someone loitering near the building that night, but descriptions were vague. A female, medium build, possibly someone familiar with the building. Without surveillance cameras, rare in residential neighborhoods in 1994, investigators had no visual leads. Detectives explored three main theories: dispute or grudge. Was Maud targeted because of a personal conflict? Interviews with friends, neighbors, and relatives revealed no enemies and no history of disputes. Random arsonist. Portland had seen sporadic fires set by thrill-seekers and drifters. Detectives interviewed known arsonists in the region, but no evidence tied them to the apartment fire. Familiar connection. Investigators suspected someone who knew the building and possibly Maud herself. Several tenants and local acquaintances were questioned. One name, Vicky McMahon, surfaced during informal interviews as someone with a history of erratic behavior and suspected fire setting. But in 1994, there was no physical evidence to connect her to the blaze. The case file grew thicker with reports, but thinner on viable leads. By mid-1995, the homicide arson was classified as open but inactive, joining other unsolved cases in Portland's archives. For Maud's family, the idea that she had died in a deliberate fire, with no one held accountable, was devastating. After 1995, the case grew quiet. The fire was remembered, but without new evidence, investigators had nothing to act on. In early 2025, the Portland Police Department Cold Case Unit reopened the Holden file. The decision was part of a broader review of unsolved homicides in Maine, focusing on cases with potential for new leads. Detectives re-interviewed surviving witnesses. This time, one individual provided details that had not been shared in 1994. The testimony, combined with a re-examination of the case file, pointed strongly toward a single suspect, Vicky McMahon. McMahon had been known to Portland authorities in the 1990s for erratic behavior and suspected fire setting, But back then, investigators lacked physical evidence to tie her to the Holden fire. By 2025, multiple witness statements, behavioral patterns, and corroborating circumstantial details gave detectives confidence. The Portland Police Department publicly named McMahon as the perpetrator. The case was officially classified as closed. Suspect identified. But there was a final twist. McMahon had died in 2023. With McMahon deceased, prosecutors could not pursue charges. Still, the announcement closed the case after more than 30 years. The exact motive remains unclear. Detectives suggested it may have been linked to personal animosity, possibly rooted in neighborhood disputes or random targeting. There was no evidence of robbery. The fire was an act of destruction, not theft. The conclusion was not a courtroom verdict, but a public statement. Maud Holden's killer had a name. For Maud's surviving relatives, the closure was bittersweet. They would never see a trial, never hear a guilty plea, never watch a sentencing. But they finally had an answer. Her niece told reporters in 2025, "We waited more than 30 years. We would have preferred justice in court. But at least we know who did this. We can finally say her name alongside the truth." For Portland, the case's closure was a reminder of how long justice can take. Residents who remembered the 1994 fire spoke of relief, and city officials praised the persistence of cold case detectives. The fire marshal's office emphasized the importance of witness testimony. Evidence can be preserved, but it's people who carry the last pieces of the puzzle. In this case, it was a voice, finally willing to speak, that brought the truth forward.